In this unit, we will learn about different ways to assess personality. To begin with, I would like you to have a go at completing a personality test. So you could search for the mini IPIP scale, and then please complete it. So when you are calculating the total scores, you will notice that they are reverse scoring items. So this is to change the direction of how the question is being phrased in order to reduce response bias. So please also make note of this when you calculate your total score. You might wonder, why would we want to learn about a person's personality trait? So these do have implications across different psychology disciplines, but in overall, they do help us describe a person. So coming from the occupational and educational psychology lens, they may utilize personality tests to predict a person's achievement or performance. And for health psychologists, they may utilize these different tests to predict how long a person may live. So high conscientiousness people tend to have healthier bodies and mental health and will live longer because they engage in more adaptive behaviors, like eating nutritious diets, engage in exercising behaviors. So these behaviors may predict their longevity. When we talked about research methods in week 2, we mentioned the importance of adopting a measure that is highly reliable and valid. So reliable here means to produce similar or the same results across time, and valid means measuring what we want to measure. So if we want to learn whether personality traits are stable, we may look at test-retest reliability. So does a person's personality score measured at one point in time correlate highly with their personality score assessed later? So they found that neuroticism actually are not quite stable. So looking at the retest score, so 0.40 to 0.60, it is less than 0.05, so it has unacceptable reliability, meaning that neuroticism may change over time. As we mentioned before, occupational psychologists may utilize personality tests to predict workers' behavior. So they may utilize these tests to select employees with certain traits. And they may utilize these tests to decide who to hire. So stressful occupations like medical doctors, teachers, and critical care workers may need to have certain levels of resiliency in order to thrive at their work. Resilience is the ability to adapt well and deal effectively with different future challenges. In the past, people have utilized different metaphors like resistant band, the leaning Pisa tower, and also weeds to describe psychological resilience. There is lack of consensus or a universal definition of resilience, but researchers tend to agree that resilience can be described as being able to promote personal assets, so utilizing different strengths and skills, be able to overcome adversity, and being able to adapt well to different challenging situations, and finally, are more protected from the negative effects of stresses. So being able to recover from stress quite quickly. But it is important to note that resilience is a context and temporal dependent process. So it is a characteristic that is not present across different contexts and time. Therefore, we say that resilience is not a fixed-term personality trait. The personality traits of resilience and also extraversion are just some examples of how certain traits can be changed or developed across time. Therefore, standard personality tests may have poor predictive validity. In a newer technique called situational judgment tests, these tests are based on developing hypothetical occupation scenarios, which aim to predict employees' future behavior. For example, if you are hiring teachers, you may ask teachers to answer how they might act when dealing with student misbehavior, rather than answer how they might act in terms of a general stressor in life. Situational judgment tests are developed based on the occupational context, which aims to directly predict applicants' future behavior. My PhD research investigated resilience among trainee teachers. Through conducting a one-way repeated measures analysis of variance, I examined whether there were statistical differences in trainee teachers' resilience scores across 3 time points. The results of my PhD suggest that without a mental health intervention, trainee teachers' resilience didn't statistically change across time. So this suggests that it seems that resilience scores could be stable. Does that mean that teachers' resilience can't be promoted? So that wasn't the case. For another portion of my PhD, I developed a novel resilience intervention by targeting one of the key mechanisms of resilience, which was interpretation bias. I found large effect sizes and change in resilience scores after taking part in the intervention. So the effect size tells us how meaningful the relationship between variables or the difference between groups are, and the larger effect size is better. My PhD is a good example to showcase that personality can be inconsistent across situations. For example, in the presence of a resilience intervention, the levels of resilience can be improved. People tend to overestimate the extent to which personality traits are consistent across situation and time. However, this is not the case. For my PhD studies, I found that teachers didn't remain resilient when dealing with stresses both at home and at work. Here is another example to show how personality change may occur. Vernier gauge is a famous example. So an iron rod was driven through his skull when constructing the railroad. In most brain-damaging accidents like this would result in death, but he survived and was conscious and being able to get up, walk, and speak. However, he experienced personality changes after the accident. So before then, he was a well-mannered person, but after the accident, he behaved quite oddly and lost impulse control due to having the iron rod driven through his skull. This slide shows how some changes in the Big Five may occur across time. So conscientiousness may increase through young adulthood to middle age. And also agreeableness also may increase through age and peak at around 50 to 70 years. However, neuroticism and extroversion may decrease with age. Now I would like to bring in some cultural influences here. So the strength of personality traits may vary across culture. In Asian countries, collectivism is the norm, and we emphasize on maintaining relationships and social harmony. So in Asian countries, there's a larger proportion of people to be low on extroversion. And in Central and South American cultures, individualism is the norm, so they emphasize on personal goals. So there are more people high on openness. And in European countries, there are more people high on neuroticism. So the concept of selective migration is that people may choose to move to places that matches their personalities and needs. For example, a person who is high on openness may prefer to settle in a place that is diverse and innovative, like California. There are different ways to measure personality, and let's first talk about objective tests. So objective test doesn't mean that there is no bias. Rather, the term objective here refers to the method used to score a person's responses, but not that the responses themselves is not biased. So psychologists may administer the test, but uses scores to code the answers rather than using their own interpretation. So a person's test responses may be highly subjective and influenced by different biases, but here we say it is objective because we use quantitative scoring to code their responses. The benefits associated with self-report is that it is simple, easy to administer, and no special equipment is needed. However, the responses could be biased due to making subjective ratings, and those who are less educated, young children, or older adults with dementia may not comprehend the questions correctly. And we may want to engage in validation. This is to confirm whether a measure adequately represents the underlying variable that it is supposed to measure. And we make comparisons with other well-validated measures. Here is a more detailed description on the drawbacks of self-report. The first one is socially desirable presentation. Self-raters may be motivated to present themselves in an overly favorable and socially desirable way, for example, in job applications and interviews. The second one is the self-enhancement bias. People are more motivated to ignore or downplay their least desirable traits and focus more on their positive attributes. And for the final one is the reference group effect. This is to compare yourself with others. For example, if you tend to work harder than your friends, you might see yourself as relatively conscientious, even if you are not particularly conscientious in an absolute sense. Although personality can change across time, here are some results found using validated personality measures. First, conscientiousness may predict academic and job performance across time. And personality ratings can predict well-being, physical health, and also mortality risks later. And finally, personality ratings are associated with psychological disorders. When the collection of self-ratings is not possible, like doing it on infants and cognitively impaired older adults, we may utilize informant ratings. This is to utilize descriptions provided by people around them, like parents, teachers, spouse, friends, or both. This is useful when the validity of self-ratings are questionable, or the collection of self-ratings is not feasible or possible. And nowadays, researchers may do self-ratings and also informant ratings at the same time and make comparisons. However, it is important to note that there are limitations associated with informant ratings. For example, when you ask a person to do the rating but they don't know the target person well enough to give a decent description, or if they know the person too well and still provide overly positive ratings, like when you are writing a letter of recommendation for someone, this can bias the results as well. Lastly, we will cover projective tests. So this type of testing aims to uncover a person's actual feelings and desires that are hidden from their conscious awareness. The Rorschach ink block test was used by psychologists to diagnose mental conditions like schizophrenia. They measure attributes like creativity, intelligence, and temperament. So psychologists will observe what content people describe and which location of the ink block did the person focus on, and whether people are able to respond quickly. So being able to respond quickly means being at ease with others. And for the thematic or perception test, people may generate stories about a series of pictures, which can help the psychologist understand the implicit motives behind. So there are a number of limitations on this because it is hard to score and administer. And today, some psychologists argue that this type of testing is considered pseudoscience. Thank you for watching this video, and in our final unit, we will talk about the importance of self-regulation. See you in the next video.